Hello and welcome to the CX Files for February 2nd, 2023. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Hey, Mark, it's Peter Ryan. I'm back in Montreal after spending an amazing trip last week, a few days in Munich and a number of days in Tbilisi in Georgia. Great to be home, but still savoring some of the memories of being back in Europe.
Well, it's always good to be back in Europe. I've got my next trip planned in May, I think, but we'll see what happens between now and then. We've got an author on the pod today, and that's quite interesting for us because I don't think that we've covered that many CX books. I mean, apart from the stuff we've worked on ourselves. But published today by Bloomsbury is a new book by John Sills, who's the managing director at the Foundation based in London. Foundation is a management consultancy and they're really focused on growth. But our conversation really focused on his new book, which is called The Human Experience. This is focused on CX and kind of specifically how the march towards, more and more digital experience is changing the way that we see CX. And I think that, in John's opening chapters, he talks about the Wizard of Oz and the Tin Man and companies that have no heart. And I think that what's really interesting about this is that we've all seen it. We've all seen this rush to digital, and this idea that we can switch everything over to digital relationships. But then at the end of the day, that just makes everything very transactional, don't you think?
I wouldn't argue with anything you said, Mark. And it's great when you have two published authors on the same podcast. And obviously, you're a very pervasive publisher of books. It's great to have John and talking about something that we're just hearing a lot about right now. As you say, it really renders interactions very transactional. It takes the human element out when everything is being pushed to digital. And we're hearing more and more backlash from consumers about this. Probably the most obvious one that we could cite would be what Frontier Airlines decided to do right around the Thanksgiving period in 2022 to effectively shut down their contact centers from a voice perspective and go exclusively digital. But they're just one of many. For me and my standpoint as a consumer, I'm getting really sick of the fact that whenever I'm calling more and more businesses to try and get an issue resolved or even to pose a simple question, I'm being told that they've shut down their telephone lines and that we have to go online. Sometimes it's just not convenient to go online. Sometimes the interface on the mobile application, if I'm out and about, isn't very conducive to customer service. And this whole idea about rendering everything digitally transactional is quite frankly not very conducive to building relationships. And I think this is why the discussion we're going to hear from John today is so salient in terms of where we are in 2023.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting point because we're talking about this transactional idea of customer relationship, or the idea that just by offering multiple channels, that brings you closer to the company. But I think the reality is that we should be stepping back and thinking about how do the companies that we love actually behave? There's some companies out there that you keep on going back to time and time again. And there's something about the way that they operate and the way that they're helpful and the way that they never let you down. That is completely different to your cell phone provider, for example.
Yeah, and as you say, there are companies out there that we have emotional connections with, that we are passionate about, that we really believe in. I've got several, and I actually am finding now more and more, even some of those companies, ones that I've evangelized to my friends and to my family, are really starting to fall short when it comes to how they're managing CX. And once again, pushing towards a more transactional approach and not building those relationships up, which can literally last a lifetime.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the key points, because if you're actually doing this well, then you should be building a relationship over decades. I mean, if you are, let's say, a car manufacturer, you should be building a relationship that's going to make sure that customer keeps coming back and buying your cars, rather than it always being transactional and only ever focused on today's sale.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that this is a good point where we can move over to the discussion with John and find out a little bit more about where he's coming from on this. And as I said before, it's not very often we get two published authors on the same pod. So listeners, take advantage of it.
Let's go straight to the interview with John Sills, the author of The Human Experience. Okay, John, it's great to get you on the podcast. Thanks for agreeing to appear. Now, you've got a new book coming out, and I think actually on the day that this podcast is published is the day of publication of the book, which is called The Human Experience. It's published by Bloomsbury. I really wanted to just ask you first, what inspired the book? I know that, I browsed through it and I could see that it's focused very much on humanity in customer experience. And you talked a bit about the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz and this idea that, there's a lot of companies out there that are functioning but haven't got any kind of heart. So maybe you could just sort of open by explaining what led to the book.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on the show as well. And you're right, I mentioned The Wizard of Oz earlier. I felt it was probably if my book can be anywhere near as successful as that book, I'll probably be quite happy. But I think there were a couple of things behind it, really. There was a longer term thing, which is right the way through my career, from starting on a market stall in Essex when I was 16. I've always had the kind of customer at the heart of what I've done. It's always been important to me. And as I've got older, I've moved away from kind of just being the person serving the customer and more into being the customer, and therefore starting to actually get quite annoyed with the way organizations have gone over the past few years. And that feeling of actually customers and people are just being let down. It's their lives really that companies are wasting when they're putting them on hold for hours or making them chase and building stress up. So there's this kind of underlying frustration, I suppose, that's built into what I do now as a job to try and help organizations be better at that. But I guess the other thing that kind of really inspired it is that I've been writing articles for a few years and I've always wanted to write a book. And then I was in the shower as lots of great ideas appear in the shower. I was in the shower during COVID and I kind of started thinking about human and the word human. And I thought, that's it. That's the word that kind of ties together everything I think I'm trying to say, which is when you really boil customer experience down, it's not that complicated. You just need to strip away a lot of what's there at the moment and just be a real human and a real person and show that humanity. And that's what creates the experience. So once I had that word and that idea, I was able to then start to pull things together and create the book. So that's how I've got to now. And you're right, the book comes out today in the UK and then in the USA and Australia in the next few months. Okay,
that's excellent. Well, I mean, this idea of humanity and humans being involved in customer service, customer experience, I think it's an ongoing discussion, because we've seen so many companies trying to move to a digital type of experience. And often it's a really unsatisfactory the results, are just not what people expect. Do you think that we've seen it's more to do with seeing like poorly implemented digital CX, or is there more of a misunderstanding by brands about just how important the human element really is?
Yeah, I think it's a real mix. I mean, clearly there's been massive advancements over the past 20 years in some elements of customer experience with the digital services that have been on offer. And it's brilliant. If you look at something like banking, for example, it's great that you can check your balance and make payments in an instant without needing to go into a branch. That's clearly a big improvement. But I think what's got lost, it almost isn't even so much the human, but it is the humanity, as you said earlier. There's one thing to have real people involved, and I do think that's really beneficial in some circumstances when maybe you're looking for real expertise. But even if you're delivering digital services, you need to keep that humanity. And I think what a lot of organizations have done, if they've seen this digital utopia turn up as a great opportunity to cut costs and get quick fixes to problems and be able to have a much more efficient business. But in doing that, they've lost that humanity in the actual services. And that might be the language they use or the way they communicate or the expectations they set or don't set in some cases. And the lack of that humanity means that while the experience is more functional and more efficient, it loses that emotion for customers. It loses that emotional connection. That's worse for customers as an overall experience. But actually, it also means they're just less connected with those companies anyway, because everything becomes very commoditized. And then when you add on to that, the errors that come from those digital services not being really well delivered, because everyone's trying to move fast and break things, you then just get the failure demand of customers having to phone you up or come back or send you emails. So actually, you're not really saving any money at all, but you're just, costing yourself money and having a less close relationship with your customers at the same time. So it's the humanity rather than just the human that I think organizations need to keep in, even if they're delivering it through digital services.
Yeah. And I've noticed in the past year or so that my Siri has actually become very much more useful than it used to be a couple of years ago. And I think that, even if we look at the news from just the past few months, we've seen tools like Dolly and ChatGPT, and these kind of tools that almost seem to have some sort of humanity in the way that they can actually generate conversations and generate articles. I mean, are we sort of getting to that point where digital systems can understand people and customers and perhaps inject some more humanity? Or is it not that the systems are getting better, that, humanity is just the fact that, we need humans in the system?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. And some of these tools are absolutely fantastic, as you said, like ChatGPT, but they're brilliant for giving information, for distilling information, for sharing information and bringing information together. And they're clearly much better than a lot of the web chats that are available at the moment, a lot of the chatbots that just don't seem to be able to understand what you're asking. I think the trick is with some of those tools is it is about asking the right question. And whilst at the moment they can give an awful lot of information, what they can't necessarily do is predict what the question is you're trying to ask, because only customers can really explain what is the outcome that they're trying to get to. And then you can use those tools to help get there. But the problem with that, Mark, is actually, you talk about them understanding customers. Customers don't even understand themselves. Customers are, we're all contradictions. Tell you a short story. I was doing a project a few years ago with a big food manufacturer. And we were going shopping with customers, with people, to kind of understand their buying habits around convenience food, ready-made meals. And I interviewed this one lady, and she was a real kind of, really focused on her health, mid-40s, was a yoga teacher, said she cooked everything from scratch, would never use ready meals. And so that wrote all that down. That all made sense. Then I went shopping with her in Waitrose a couple of hours later, and we were pushing the trolley up and down. And we got to the ready meals aisle, and I thought, well, we're going to fly down here really quickly. And halfway through, she stopped and she got a ready-made mashed potato and kind of threw that in. So I didn't say anything. And then a bit further down, she picked up a ready chopped red onion and threw that in. So I said, well, hang on. I said, I thought you said you cooked everything from scratch. Like, how does that fit with what you said? And she went, well, I haven't got time to chop vegetables. Like, I'm a busy person, So she completely discounted that. And then we got to the confectionery aisle and the alcohol aisle. And again, she'd said, I'm so healthy, super fit, super healthy. And she just swept in a load of chocolate and a load of wine, like properly armfuls of it going in. So I said, well, how did that match up with what you said? And she went, well, that's for girls' night on Friday night. That doesn't count. And so even herself had completely discounted that from the story she wanted to tell. And so I think that's where there's still that need for a real human element, because you still need to understand people better than they can understand themselves. And that means that when people contact you as an organization, the question they're asking you might not be the question they should be asking you, because they might not realize what the right question is. And that's where that humanity, and sometimes humans, are then still really important to help piece together those different bits. It's not just about efficiency, it's then about creativity and be able to come up with the answer that the customer might need, as opposed to just providing really great information that's been distilled from across a number of sources. That may come in time, but that time's not now.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it comes to one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because across this industry, there's a load of myths, and you introduced some of them in the book. And I thought that there was a good example you gave to do with customer loyalty. We always talk about loyalty as an aspiration, and if you deliver a great service, then the customer will be loyal forever. And you talked about your local taxi firm that you'd used for years and years, but as soon as Uber came along, it was just easier, and so you never called a taxi ever again. So I think, what's the reality around all of these myths that we look up to in the industry then?
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's three myths that I talk about: the myth of loyalty, the myth of feedback, and the myth of ROI. Just to finish off that story, you started telling about the myth of loyalty. There is another part to that, actually, which is, you're right, I did go from my local taxi firm, which was kind of cash only, and you had to ring up to Uber because it was so useful. But about a year later, my local taxi firm introduced its own app, which allowed you to pay by card and allowed you to know where the car was. And it had more cars locally than Uber. So just as quickly, I stopped using Uber and I just went back to my local taxi firm because they'd become more useful again. So you're right. I talk about the myth of loyalty, and I really do believe that is a myth that is a very dangerous myth for organizations to buy into. There's this sense that organizations believe that once they've got you as a customer, well, you're just going to stay as a customer forever then. And that's why organizations spend so much of their time on onboarding. You know, if you go and work with any organization, they'll say, right, we want to look at our onboarding journey first of all, as if the rest of it doesn't count. And there's a brilliant book called Ends by a guy called Joe McLeod that's all about endings and customer experience endings and why it is we're uncomfortable with them and why organizations don't look at them. Whereas if you were Sky or BT, for example, rather than putting your customers through that challenge of having to ring up because you want to leave and have to go through all the different escape room maze of, you know, you're going to have this offer or that offer, and do you really want to leave? If they just made it really easy and really pleasant experience to move on, then in 2 years later, when your contract's up with whoever you went to, you're going to think straight back to Sky again. So it's taking a slightly different view of it. And the same with the myth of feedback as well. We live in an epidemic of feedback at the moment where you can't have any experience without having any kind of survey sent to you, 10 questions or recommendations on anything that you've experienced. But even with that, it fools senior leaders into believing that they're really close to what matters to customers, but it doesn't. All they're close to is customers' opinions of their product and service, not what actually matters to that customer in their life. And bringing those two things together, if you want to stay really useful to customers, you have to stay close to what matters to them in their lives, independent of your organization, then work out how to be useful, not just believe you're close to what matters to customers because you've got reams of PDF and PowerPoint data being presented to you every week that tells you an average score of an average customer that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, so if the executives are just getting bombarded with all this information, survey data, reports from analysts, stuff in the Financial Times, where do they focus then? What are the sort of specific enablers that they can focus on that actually makes human experience work really well?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. So again, in the book, I talk about 5 different enablers that I think leaders and organizations need to focus on. One of those is leading on from what I've just talked about, which is around being really connected to your customers. So the organizations that I studied 10 organizations as part of the book. They all had one of these traits in common, which is the way that they stayed really close to what mattered to their customers. And it wasn't surveys and it wasn't NPS. But it was things like experiencing what your customers are experiencing on a regular basis. So Chiltern Railways, for example, the one of, if not currently, the best rail network in the UK for customer satisfaction. Nearly all of their senior leadership live on the Chiltern Railways train line. So they have to use the Chiltern Railways train every morning and every evening. And they have to wear their name badge when they're on that train line every morning and every evening. So not only are they experiencing what their customers are experiencing, what their passengers are experiencing every day, they're also getting real, raw, unfiltered feedback from their customers when things aren't going so well. And it's the same with Citymapper. So whenever Citymapper moves into a new city and it wants to start doing a new city, they have this thing called the traveling circus, where they take a group of them, different people from across different departments in Citymapper, and they essentially move to that city for a month. And every couple of days, they move Airbnb to a different part of the city. So they spend a month trying out every different train route, every different train line, every different bus route that they can in that city to understand how that city works and thinks about transport. And even little things on Citymapper, like they change the logo of the metro sign or the underground sign to fit the city you're in. It's a really tiny detail, but they could just have a standard one that would work across every different city. So they're very, very close to customers. And the other part is about empowerment. So as I say, I've got 5 enablers. One of the other ones is empowerment and having really empowered colleagues. Because when you're looking at providing a human experience and bringing humanity into what you do, the best way to do that is to let people be human. At the moment, organizations are kind of full of humans. Organizations are full of people who aren't allowed to be people, humans who aren't allowed to be human. And so if you empower your people to do what's right and to make things better for the customers, you avoid this, well, I would if I could, but I can't mentality that's so frustrating for both people. Again, AO.com do this brilliantly. They're a white goods delivery service in the UK. They have a budget. Anyone of their drivers, anyone of their team can use this budget to just do something nice for customers if they think that it's needed. And there's a famous story they tell of one of their delivery drivers that was delivering a fridge, and he phoned up the people he was delivering it to, and their son answered. And they said, I'm going to be there in an hour. And he said, okay, that's fine. We're just having a party at the moment because it's my parents' wedding anniversary. But that's fine. Just come on in. You can put it around the side. So on the way, the driver just stopped off at the local garden centre. He bought a plant in AO colours, which is green and white. So that's handy if you're buying plants. Turned up at the house, said, hi, I'm from AO. Here's your fridge and also happy anniversary. And it was such a simple thing. It probably cost £20, £30, but it meant so much. And it's so human because that's what you do as a human. If someone's celebrating and you know them, you do something to recognise that celebration. But there was no need to phone up or get permission. They just knew they could do it. And all of these organisations I've studied have a similar level of empowerment in their frontline team. They hire great people. They trust them to do a great job. If something doesn't quite go right, they just talk about it afterwards and steer them in the right direction. The complete opposite of the way lots of organisations work at the moment.
Yeah, and is that empowerment, is that leading to a change in what we expect from organizations then? Like it's more like a relationship rather than just a transaction. You know, it's not just where's my parcel. It's more like a conversation or an engagement.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think what the advancement in digital technology has done is it's separated those transactions that we're having with organizations. So, you know, to use that bank example, if I'm just checking my balance or making a payment, that's all I want. I just want that done and I want it done as quick as possible. But for most of the other things I deal with an organization, I do expect a level of human understanding. And that means, you know, you need to be accessible. If I want to speak to you, I expect to be able to speak to you. If I want to email you, I expect to be able to email you. You know, I don't want to feel kind of restricted. And the days of just feeling like a number are long gone. You know, everything is so much more transparent now, particularly with social media. And I think everyone knows what a good or bad customer experience is now. It's not a mythical science that really needs breaking apart. Like we know what it is and people know if they're giving a good experience or not. It's whether or not they've got the permission to act in that human way in an organization that I think really makes the difference between those that do it brilliantly and those that have good intentions but ultimately don't do it.
And I was just wondering if the channel makes any difference then. You know, for example, is there a difference in the type of interaction if you're phoning or emailing or using a chat? Because you mentioned there, maybe one of the important things is that you don't want to be restricted. You want to use any kind of channel that you want to use and not actually be restricted. But do you think that there's any sort of difference in the humanity of any of these different types of channel then?
In a sense, no, really, because I think one thing that customers do want, and in the book I've got these 7 behaviors that I think that organizations should all kind of exhibit to create this human experience. Customers do want consistency. So regardless of which channel I use, I want to make sure I'm going to get the same answer to the problem. You know, and I might one day choose I want to do it on web chat and another day I might want to phone up, or it might be dependent on me as a customer. It might be dependent on the thing that I want to talk to you about or the thing I need help with. But I do want consistency. I don't want to believe that if I'm using web chat, that's a lesser service than if I phone up. And that I think does cause a lot of issues. I mean, I think regardless of which channel you use, you want to make sure you've got their attention and you want to make sure that it's done at an appropriate speed. That's one of the challenges we have with web chat at the moment. I think that when web chat first came out, it was actually pretty good. Actually, when you were speaking directly to an agent, you felt like they had their attention and you could get things done pretty quickly. I tend to find more often than not now when you're doing web chat, it takes forever because they take a long time to answer your question because they're dealing with 5 or 6 people at once. Again, I think it's maybe a bit of a misconception, a bit of a myth in itself about efficiency, because really you're not actually multitasking. You're not doing 6 things at once. You're not having 6 conversations at once. You're switching between one to the other. Whereas if you just dealt with that one, you could probably get that done in 5 minutes, and might mean a bit of a wait, but it might mean the overall conversation is less. And I think with that, you need to, as I said, you need to be accessible. So these channels all need to be available. You know, I've got a personal hatred of do not reply email addresses. I think there's nothing that kind of screams arrogance of an organization more than, you know, sending you a text message or sending you an email, but then saying you can't reply to us on that channel. You know, do not reply to us. We don't want to speak to you, which is bizarre. You know, I think up until 20 years ago, every organization wanted to talk to their customers. Like, you want to speak to your customers every time there's an opportunity to build a relationship. And now it's kind of the opposite. Like, organizations almost do everything they can to stop customers contacting them unless they're contacting them in the very specific way that they want to be contacted. So again, I think to your point, you can do different things in different channels, and you can create different experiences in different channels. But however you choose to do that, I think you need to be accessible across any channel that a customer wants to contact you through. And then you need to be consistent in the experience that they give, as opposed to, that being beneficial in one or a different answer in another one.
Yeah, and it's interesting because across the industry, especially the companies that sell contact center services, they still generally price it as, the number of people, full-time equivalents in a contact center. And then all of the metrics are generally around handling calls, average handle time, all this kind of stuff. But what you're really talking about is experience and satisfaction across any sort of channel. So how do you price that rather than seats in a contact center?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I'm maybe not the right person to answer exactly how you price it necessarily, but I do think, to your point, it is about experience and servicing, but more than that, it's about outcomes. It's about customer outcomes, and this is going to be language that's going to be becoming more familiar now that regulators like the FCA with their new consumer duty regulation are focusing on customer outcomes as well. It's, are you helping the customer do the thing that they want to do, almost regardless of what channel you're doing it in. The contact centers are such an interesting place at the moment. There's been this illusion of efficiency, somewhat forced by COVID, to work from home because that saves money on the building. But in almost every contact center now, you're finding this kind of perfect storm of not being able to recruit enough people. The people that you do recruit want to work from home, and that feels more efficient, but actually it's not, because you lose learning by osmosis, and you lose coaching, and you lose people overhearing and giving regular feedback. It's also much harder to ask your teammates for help, which means team managers are now drowned in Teams chats or Zoom chats, trying to sort out problems rather than be able to kind of speak to people, speak to the team. There's no connection in the team. So lots of contact centers I know are now really starting to struggle with that situation. And then you have average call waiting time over the top of it, which really, just doesn't make sense. And I don't know many people in organizations that do think it makes sense, but it stays because it's still, the most popular metric and the easiest metric. I did once try and persuade one of our clients to change from kind of average call waiting time to human lives wasted. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if at the end of the year you could add up all the time customers have spent on hold to you and just convert that into kind of lifetimes if it was that much, and that might kind of bring home the humanity of it. But even if you don't do that, you're better to look at the extremes rather than say an average wait time of 5 minutes. You're better to say, well, let's celebrate 20% of people didn't have to wait at all, but actually let's go and look at that 10% that had to wait more than 20 minutes. And that's the problem. That will bring your average down. But even then, if you're looking at an average wait time of 5 minutes, it's interesting that that's become acceptable, that a customer waits 5 minutes. That's okay. They can wait 5 minutes to come and speak to us. And now it's a delight when you actually get through. So the pricing model is a tricky question to look at. It feels like it needs a complete overhaul. But for me, I'm looking at customer outcomes and things like, well, how often does a customer have to phone you back because they didn't get the answer they wanted the first time? And if you can get that to never, you're doing brilliantly. But if it's up at 30%, then your average call waiting doesn't matter, because you're getting them off the phone, but they're just phoning back up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so finally then, just to wrap up, I mean, who do you really want to read this book, and what are they going to get from it that's going to help them in 2023 then?
Yeah, I think the short answer is business leaders. I think it's, whilst it's badged as a customer experience book, and it looks like a customer experience book, and there's a lot in there about that. For me, a lot of this is about the culture of an organization, and actually, do you want to become a customer-led organization? Do you want to build a successful organization that makes things better for customers? So I'd love kind of business leaders, CEOs and CMOs to be reading this and sharing it in the organization, and just getting people to think a bit about, are they a human organization? Do they have this humanity, or has that been stripped away? And I hope that the book would give them, some stories to help remind them of what that's like. And everyone will know what it's like because we're all customers. We will just forget it when we step into our organization every day. But also some practical advice in terms of the behaviors and the enablers that you can start to measure and assess your organization against. And we've built an assessment to allow people to do that, to kind of help really try and understand where you are at the moment. I also, though, Marcus, I think it would be a nice read for anyone really that gets in any way frustrated by customer experience, because I hope it's quite a cathartic book to read where you can kind of read it and go, yeah, I hate that too. And just kind of sharing my anger and my frustration at some of the experiences I have. So definitely business leaders, but if not, everyone else in the world would be great.
Well, that's what every author wants, is everyone out there buying a copy.
Exactly right.
Okay, excellent. Well, that was great. Thank you very much. And I hope the book does well.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.